All right, today we're going on a different kind of mission. We're going to uncover one of the world's largest and, yeah, most invisible sources of pollution. It's a carbon footprint of military-grade proportions, and it has been hiding in plain sight for decades. Let's dig in.
So, let me ask you a question. What if I told you that the world's fourth biggest climate polluter, an entity with a carbon footprint bigger than all of Russia, isn't a country you can find on any map?
That's right, because it's not a country at all. We're talking about the combined armed forces of the entire world, a colossal carbon-guzzling machine that operates almost completely outside of our global climate agreements.
And the scale here is just staggering. Researchers estimate that global militaries, along with their massive supply chains, account for 5.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than the entire global aviation and shipping industries put together. We talk about those sectors all the time, so why is this one flying completely under the radar?
Well, the answer lies in what experts call the military emissions gap. You can think of it as a giant black hole in our global carbon accounting, a blind spot that lets an emitter of this size stay effectively invisible to, well, pretty much everyone. So how did this even happen? Well, believe it or not, it was designed this way. The major international climate treaties have systematically carved out exemptions for the military. Way back in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol allowed countries to just not report emissions from their overseas military operations. Then, the 2015 Paris Agreement made reporting any military emissions totally voluntary. And the justification has always been the same: national security. The argument is that revealing fuel use could expose strategic weaknesses.
But here's the thing. This isn't just a wartime problem. A huge chunk of the military's carbon footprint comes from its everyday operations. The constant state of readiness. This is the price of preparedness. And that price is going up. Just look at Europe. The Rearm Europe initiative is an €800 billion push to modernize armies and crank up weapons production. This kind of massive financial investment is a direct driver of these peacetime emissions, fueling the very industries that create the carbon bootprint.
So it's really crucial to understand that these peacetime emissions come in two main flavors. On one hand, you've got your operational emissions. That's the obvious stuff, right? The jet fuel, the diesel for tanks, the electricity to run massive military bases. But then you have the embodied emissions. This is the hidden carbon cost that's literally baked into manufacturing the weapons and building all the infrastructure in the first place.
To really get a handle on embodied emissions, let's zoom in on just one iconic piece of military hardware, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. It's one of the most common fighter jets on the planet.
Okay, so the F-16's body is mostly aluminum, but look at this. For every single kilogram of aluminum made for that jet, over 16 kilograms of CO2 equivalent are pumped into the atmosphere. And that little E just means equivalent. It's a way to measure all the different greenhouse gases on the same scale. As you can see, carbon composites are even more intense. This is the perfect example of embodied emissions. Before this jet even flies a single mission, it already has a massive carbon debt just from being built.
Now, if peacetime operations are the chronic, long-term problem, then active war is the acute disaster. The environmental damage from conflict goes way beyond just the exhaust from a tank. It literally scars the Earth itself.
Let's look at some recent examples, starting in Ukraine with the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam back in June 2023. This wasn't just an attack on a piece of infrastructure. Many have called it an act of ecocide.
The immediate results were just catastrophic. We're talking about 18 billion cubic meters of water, a flood of biblical proportions. But the real long-term damage is what was in that water. Over 90,000 tons of heavy metals, oil, and industrial chemicals got washed into the Dnipro River and out into the Black Sea, creating a toxic legacy that's going to linger for decades.
Now let's shift to another theater of modern war, the city. After the brutal battle to retake Mosul in Iraq, the city was left in absolute ruins. But what actually happens to all that rubble?
We're talking about over 11 million tons of debris. And this isn't just broken concrete. It's a toxic cocktail of asbestos, chemical residues from bombs and bullets, and fine dust. When that stuff gets improperly dumped, say into the Tigris River, it creates what the UN calls secondary pollution hotspots, poisoning the very land and water people need to rebuild their lives. And now, let's turn to a very recent high-intensity conflict. Researchers have actually started to calculate the carbon footprint of the initial military campaign in Gaza, which gives us a rare, almost real-time look at the immediate climate cost of war.
In just the first 60 days, the direct military operations themselves produced nearly 1.9 million tons of CO2 equivalent. But look at that second bar. The projected emissions from eventually rebuilding everything that was destroyed, that's over 16 times higher. And that brings us to the final, and maybe most overlooked, wave of military emissions.
This is what you could call the carbon echo of war. Long after the fighting stops, the enormous task of reconstruction begins, and it comes with its own absolutely staggering environmental price tag. The World Bank estimates that just to rebuild Ukraine will cost at least $486 billion. It's a number that's almost hard to comprehend. But what does it mean in terms of carbon?
Well, one study projected the total carbon footprint of a 10-year reconstruction period. And the result? 741 million tons of CO2. To put that in perspective, that is more than 4 times Ukraine's entire pre-war annual emissions, just from rebuilding.
And this chart shows you exactly where it comes from. A whopping 77% is tied directly to the construction industry, making all that concrete and steel, running the heavy machinery. It really proves that the carbon cost of war doesn't end when the last bullet is fired. It echoes for decades through the rebuilding process.
So let's tie this all together. The core problems here are systemic. The reporting is voluntary, so the data we have is incomplete at best. There are no binding targets forcing militaries to cut their emissions. And all of this is happening while military spending is soaring. So you have this dangerous feedback loop where the one sector with a get-out-of-jail-free card on climate is also one of the fastest growing.
But there is a path forward here. Experts have laid out some really clear, actionable steps. First, make reporting mandatory, period. End the exemptions. Second, set binding reduction targets that put the military on the same page as the rest of society's climate goals. And third, use the military's immense purchasing power to drive change through green procurement, demanding cleaner fuels, electric vehicles, and more efficient tech. Which really leaves us with a final, crucial question. For decades, we've been told that military secrecy is essential for national security. But now, in a world being fundamentally destabilized by a climate crisis, we have to ask ourselves, what does security really mean? Can we ever achieve true, lasting security if the very institutions meant to protect us are exempt from protecting our planet?